no standard errors, no stats here. Very different thing, very different experience. So let's go on this journey together. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really honored to present here. So this is the cover of my book that just came out a couple of months ago, and I'm very excited to share it with you today. So in 2014, I visited my hometown of Belgrade, Serbia. And I went to see an exhibition at the Serbian Historical Museum called In the Name of the People, Political Repression in Serbia After World War II, which promised to display new historical documents and evidence of various crimes, such as assassinations, kidnappings, detentions in camps of the Yugoslav communist regime after 1945. As I walked through the exhibit, I stopped in my tracks. I recognized a photograph. In the Belgrade exhibit, this image was displayed in the section devoted to the communist-era camp for political prisoners on the Adriatic island of Goli Otok. The exhibition describes the photograph as the example of living conditions of Goli Otok prisoners. But I knew the photograph was not it. In front of me was a well-known photograph of prisoners from the Nazi Buchenwald concentration camp, including Elie Wiesel, who's here. And the picture was taken at Buchenwald Liberation in April 1945. It is one of the most well-known photographs of the Holocaust. So I went home, called a couple of historian friends who assured me that complaints had already been lodged with the museum and that the display was about to be corrected. Sometime thereafter, in response to an outcry from Holocaust historians, a small note was taped underneath the display that read, quote, a photograph of prisoner boxed beds in Dachau camp. That nobody bothered to check that a photograph was in fact from Buchenwald and not from Dachau is symptomatic of the broad irrelevance with which the Holocaust is met in Serbia. But what I took from this exhibition was not only the indifference and carelessness when dealing with the Holocaust, but more fundamentally the attempt to equate communism and fascism, and in doing so appropriate Holocaust remembrance and imagery to delegitimize communism. But this is hardly an indigenous Serbian invention. In Hungary, here's the House of Terror, which goes out of its way to bring home the message that fascism and communism were flip sides of the same coin. There are multiple visual representations of black totalitarianism and red totalitarianism, of the black arrow cross and the red star, of the black fascist uniform and the communist uniform. And in addition to equating fascism and communism, in doing so with very blunt force, many of these museums and memorials have also begun depicting their entire nation states as victims of foreign regimes, thus completely ignoring both the actual lived experience of various victims of these regimes, but also, and more importantly for my purposes here, completely erasing any discussion of local complicity for any historical crimes, be they crimes of the Holocaust or crimes of the Gulag. For example, the House of Terror Museum in Budapest narrates the story of Hungary's 20th century experience as a nation victim of the foreign communist regime. In this museum's exposition, the fascist era begins with the German occupation in 1944, and not in 1940, when Hungary joined the Axis alliance. This shift, therefore, completely removes the history of the Holocaust in Hungary before 1944, the period that left 60,000 Hungarian Jews killed as early as 1942, the extermination carried out not by Germans, but by Hungarian forces under the rule of Regent Miklos Horthy. Similarly, the memorial to the victims of the German occupation, erected in 2014 in Budapest, memorializes Hungary, the country, as the main victim of the German occupation, by a not very subtle depiction of Germany's imperial ego crushing of Hungary, which is symbolized by Archangel Gabriel. But note the deep domestic contestation the memorial has produced. These are handwritten postcards, memorials, and mementos, pictures left by Holocaust survivors or their family members, that want to tell the story of 430,000 Jews who were deported from Hungary, mostly to Auschwitz, the quickest rate of deportation in the history of the Holocaust, taking less than 2 months, and done with the active participation of Hungarian civil servants. And in Vilnius, Lithuania, the top tourist destination is the Museum of Victims of Genocide. But in a country that was ground zero for the Holocaust, where 95% of pre-war Jewish population was exterminated, the highest number of any occupied country anywhere in Europe, this is not the museum to those victims to that genocide. It is a museum to the victims of the Soviet occupation that in Lithuania is considered genocide. And yet, this remembrance of the 20th century is not exactly Holocaust denial. Viktor Orban even declared 2014 a year of Holocaust commemoration. However problematic, it does not prominently feature voices that deny the Holocaust as a historical fact, nor challenge its most established realities. It is also not quite the same as trivialization. While the emphasis always is on the larger ethnic groups, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Lithuanians suffering, it is relatively rare to hear outright belittling of Jewish victimization. A more nuanced way of understanding this type of Holocaust remembrance, I suggest, is as memory appropriation, where the memory of the Holocaust is used to memorialize a different kind of suffering, such as suffering under communism, or suffering from ethnic violence perpetrated by other groups. It is Holocaust remembrance turned inward and away from the actual victims of the Holocaust or the Holocaust itself into what Eva Plonowska-Zjarek calls the narcissistic identification with Jewish suffering. But why does all this matter? After all, Holocaust revisionism is not new, it's not particularly surprising, and it has certainly led to much revisionism in the West. And here is what I respond. My principal argument is that post-communist states today are dealing with conflicting sources of insecurity. They're anxious to be perceived as fully European by core Western European states, a status that remains fleeting. Being fully European, however, means sharing in the cosmopolitan European narratives of the 20th century, perhaps the strongest being the narrative of the Holocaust. But this was not always the case. What we today refer to as the Holocaust did not exist as a concept or as a marker in global collective memory prior to the early 1960s. Holocaust memory has developed over time and has gone through various phases in various countries and over various periods. In the West, what we today would recognize as the narrative of the Holocaust emerged with a series of important trials in the 1960s. Most prominent of those were, of course, the Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem and the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt. But also a series of popular cultural events, such as the American TV show The Holocaust in the late 1970s, and especially the Schindler's List in 1993. And all of them placed Jewish suffering at the center of the Holocaust narrative and presented a visual and symbolic repertoire of how we think the Holocaust looked like, which remained mostly stable until today. But the Soviet-dominated East placed events of World War II within a larger narrative of communist revolutionary triumph and anti-fascist terrorism. Communist memory was hegemonic memory, not open to alternative or particular claims on suffering, such as the suffering of the Jews. In communist Eastern Europe, Holocaust remembrance was exclusively produced through the framework of anti-fascism, because this link established the communist regime with its new post-war identity and provided it with ongoing political legitimacy. So two ways of remembering East and West diverged almost immediately after the war and developed in quite different directions throughout the post-war period. And it is at the point of contact after the end of communism in 1991 that these two ways of remembering began to cross paths. Almost immediately, the European narrative of the Holocaust created stress and resentment in post-communist states, which have been asked to accept and contribute to this primarily Western European account as members or candidate states of the European Union and NATO. The problem is that the cosmopolitan Holocaust memory as developed in the West did not narratively fit with a very different set of Holocaust memories in post-communist Europe. This lack of fit was evident primarily in the lack of centrality of the Shoah as the defining memory of the 20th century experience across the post-communist space. As Tony Judd put it, quote, "The really uncomfortable truth about World War II was that what happened to the Jews between 1939 and 1945 was not nearly as important to most of the protagonists as later sensibilities might wish," end quote. So instead of the memory of the Holocaust, Eastern European states after communism constructed their national identities on the memory of Stalinism and Soviet occupation, as well as pre-communist ethnic conflict with other states. The European centrality of the Holocaust replaced the centrality of communist and ethnic victimization as the dominant organizing narrative of post-communist states, and was therefore threatening and destabilizing to these state identities. And so in my book, I document how influencing the European Union's own memory politics and legislation in the process, post-communist states have attempted to resolve these insecurities by putting forward a new kind of Holocaust remembrance, where the memory, symbols, and imagery of the Holocaust become appropriated to represent instead crimes of communism. The criminal past is not fully denied, but the responsibility for it is misdirected. And this accomplishes two things. It absolves the nation from acknowledging responsibility for its criminal past, while at the same time it makes communism as a political project criminal. But I want to make two additional important points. The centrality of the Holocaust as a foundational European narrative is also soundly rejected across post-communist Europe because of its perceived elevation of Jewish victimhood above victimhood of other regional majority ethnic groups, a move that is increasingly openly resented. In the absence of almost any Jews across vast swaths of the East, post-communist national identities were built first on a rejection of the communist pan-national identity project, where the organizing narrative is loyalty to the socialist, not the ethnic subject. But instead of ethnic majoritarian, and therefore very homogeneous spaces, that leaves almost no room for incorporation of minority narratives. Holocaust Remembrance therefore challenges the security of a nation's identity because it problematizes the very biography on which this identity is constructed. Further, the European Holocaust memory focus on Jewish suffering is also rejected in much of post-communist Europe because it brings about discussion about extensive and deep local complicity in the Holocaust and material and political benefits of the complete Jewish absence across Eastern Europe. Jewish businesses, homes, and property have over decades of looting, followed by communist seizures, slowly morphed into the general economy with difficult and sporadic attempts at restitution. And the fact that post-World War II Jewish communities in these countries are negligible in numbers and have limited political clout is not incidental to this narrative. Once multicultural societies with large Jewish minorities are now mostly ethnically homogeneous. And this very fact of post-war ethnic homogeneity is a problem anthropologist Michael Hertzfeld called cultural intimacy, an issue of domestic identity building, the thing that builds the nation together, but simultaneously an issue of international embarrassment and sometimes even shame. And this is why much of Eastern Europe is a purposeful site of non-memory. It is a site of dismembered multi-ethnicity. It is a landscape of erasure. So next, I'm going to demonstrate that a way out of this condition of ontological insecurity, which is insecurity about your own identity, for post-communist states was to connect the undesirable remembrance of the Holocaust with a desirable remembrance of communism and its crimes. The consequence of this move was a new inverted memory of the Holocaust, where the crimes of fascism came to be represented as crimes of communism. Now, post-communist European states first encountered this European push for a unified cosmopolitan memory of the Holocaust as they tried to join various European organizations after 1991, foremost in their application for EU membership, but also membership in other European institutions, such as, for example, the Council of Europe. A major European institutional push was the Stockholm Forum on the Holocaust, held in January 2000, convened by Sweden to define a common framework for European Holocaust remembrance, research, and education. The forum established the International Task Force on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research, which has since been renamed International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And it remains the most explicit international organization that constructs, institutionalizes, and diffuses transnational Holocaust memory in Europe. In 2005, the European Parliament adopted its most complete resolution on the Holocaust, which established 27th January, the day of liberation of Auschwitz in 1945 by the Soviet Red Army, as the European Holocaust Memorial Day across the whole of the EU. And while post-communist states accepted this new regulation, they signed documents, they adopted major parameters of the memory framework, not wanting to jeopardize the delicate process of EU accession, once they were safely in the EU, the new Europeans demanded a thorough renegotiation of European memory politics, one that denies the Holocaust its centrality for post-war European memory, and instead places it on par with the other major totalitarianism of the 20th century, communism. And significantly, East European states forged alliances with the Western European right, most directly the European People's Party in the European Parliament, in pushing for EU resolutions and proclamations that would decentralize the Holocaust from pan-European memory and add crimes of Stalinism as its equal. This push to commemorate side by side the two 20th century totalitarianisms culminated in two European Union documents. The 2008 Declaration on the Proclamation of 23rd August as the European Day of Remembrance for Victims of Stalinism and Nazism, and the Resolution on European Conscience and Totalitarianism, which built on the 2008 EU Prague Declaration of the same name. This Prague Declaration is perhaps the most explicit document that lays out the ideological framework post-communist European states have used regarding the place of the Holocaust in communist memory. And while the Declaration's first article states that, quote, both the Nazi and the communist totalitarian regimes should each be judged by their own terrible merits, end quote, the Declaration then goes on to make this claim, quote, exterminating and deporting whole nations and groups of population were indivisible parts of the ideologies they availed themselves with, end quote, which explicitly equated a specifically genocidal aspect of Nazism, extermination of whole nations, and attributed it to communism. And the rhetorical move here of referring to communist crimes instead of Stalinist crimes is critical, as it implies that terror was communism's central organizing feature, which then makes it easily narratively equated with fascism. And indeed, this equation of the two regimes as being structurally the same even led one European member of parliament to declare, I quote, I ask the European Parliament to stand in solidarity with the victims of fascist communism, end quote. And please also note that the official banner of the Prague Declaration movement wants to prohibit the hammer and the sickle, not the swastika. I now want to further illustrate these arguments with some examples from contemporary Holocaust remembrance practices in Croatia, the newest EU member, and point to specific ways in which state power was used to discipline and organize political memory. Croatia's memory of the Holocaust is a source of severe state anxiety. Croatia's relationship with the Holocaust is deep, broad, and incredibly contentious. During World War II, Croatia declared an independent state, a Nazi puppet statelet, governed by the homegrown fascist movement Ustaša. The Ustaša implemented fascist racial laws in large part autonomously, and sometimes even more brutally than the German Reich. Anti-Jewish laws, Aryanization of Jewish property, followed by the deportation and extermination of Croatian Jews, were carried out with great speed and efficiency, earning much praise from Berlin. Significantly, however, the Ustaša were not interested only in the annihilation of Croatian Jews. The central part of their project was also the full-scale destruction of Croatia's large Serb and smaller Roma minorities. Across a vast network of concentration and extermination camps, the largest of which was Jasenovac, which I'll talk about more in a minute, as well as through summary executions across the country and deportations to other Nazi camps, some 32,000 or 80% of Croatian Jews, 300,000 or 17% of Croatian Serbs, and almost all Croatian Roma, about 25,000 people, were killed between 1941 and 1945. This unusable past presented a serious problem for the new Croatia, which emerged an independent state out of the rubble of the former Yugoslavia in 1991. In constructing its post-Yugoslav identity, the new Croatia needed to sidestep the communist past as a legitimate period of the country's history and institute a clear historical connection with the pre-communist state as an inspirational model for contemporary manifestation of ethnic statehood, thus stabilizing Croatia's state identity through time. The problem, however, was that the only modern independent Croatia the new state could go back to and root its new statehood in was the World War II fascist Croatian state and all the memory baggage it brought with it. And so as part of this memory replacement, Croatia embarked on a hurricane of World War II monument destruction in an attempt to visually erase any connection Croatia had with the 50 years of communism and 50 years of Yugoslavia. Almost all communist-era monuments to World War II, including the few monuments that mention specifically Jewish victims, were fully removed or partially destroyed, vandalized, or desecrated. Often, victims groups would put up a replica of the monument only to see it disappear again, often within 24 hours. Some monuments were simply replaced. In place of a monument to anti-fascist struggle, a new monument to Croatia's War of Independence from 1991 to 1995 was spring up. Out of 6,000 monuments memorializing World War II in Croatia, almost 3,000 monuments, including more than 700 monuments of exquisite artistic or cultural value, were blown up with explosives, destroyed fully or in part in the post-independence decade between 1991 and 2000. Not only was no one prosecuted for destruction of cultural property, but in many locations it was the local chapter of the Croatian ruling political party, the Croatian Democratic Union, that organized the removal of the monuments. So from the narrative perspective of the new Croatian state, the monuments to World War II had to be destroyed because they represented a symbol of a different future, a vision of an international and domestic order Croatia no longer wanted and found threatening to its new national identity. And while the public memory of the Holocaust and genocide committed in the independent state of Croatia was completely absent from the constitutive identity of the new state, a new public memory emerged that has since overtaken all other remembrance of World War II and began to be referred to as the Croatian Holocaust. This was the constructed memory of the massacre of Croatian soldiers, most of them retreating Ustaša who refused to surrender at the end of the war, but also many members of their families who had been killed by the Yugoslav communist partisans at the end of the war in May 1945 on the territories of what is today Austria and Slovenia. The events of May 1945, which are called Bleiburg in Croatia because the commemoration occurs annually at Bleiburg, Austria, even though the actual killing took place in a different location. Since 1991, for the purposes of Croatia's new state identity, began to be seen and commemorated as a communist assault on the entire Croatian nation. And from the realm of unofficial diaspora commemorations, the Bleiburg ceremonies in post-Yugoslav Croatia became fully state-sanctioned, and the Croatian government designated the day of Bleiburg commemoration every May as a day of memory of Croatian victims in the struggle for freedom and independence everywhere. And this right here was the state power to redirect Croatian memory. But this new remembrance was not a remembrance of just a massacre. It became a memory of the Holocaust, but with Croats as victims and not as perpetrators. An early explicit use of the term the Holocaust for Bleiburg occurred at the 50th anniversary of the events in 1995, when the Speaker of the Croatian Parliament addressed the Assembly and called Bleiburg the Holocaust of Croatian martyrs. So this appropriation of the Holocaust for Bleiburg specifically, and then for the larger Croatian historical suffering, has since become ubiquitous. The claim that Bleiburg was the Holocaust of Croatian Catholics has fully entered the Croatian public narrative and goes mostly unchallenged in the public sphere. The commemorations at Bleiburg, however, did not occur in an international vacuum. In fact, much of Croatia's contemporary memorialization follows the narrative framework offered in the 2008 EU Prague Declaration I talked about. The declaration's statement on two totalitarianisms is referred to whenever a discussion arises about proper remembrance of Croatia's fascist legacies. For example, at the 2011 Bleiburg commemoration, Andrija Hebrang, then a member of the Croatian parliament, said, quote, "Bleiburg is the biggest symbol of Croatian suffering that equates fascism and communism. Communism becomes worse than fascism. It becomes the world's biggest evil because it turns into the system of killing everyone who thought differently," end quote. And it is also not incidental that commemorations at Bleiburg have since become full-fledged neo-Nazi and neo-fascist gatherings, where the old black uniforms and black flags of the World War II fascist Croatian militia are proudly displayed, to increasing discomfort of Austria, on which territory this event takes place, and may have some of its own baggage related to the Holocaust. But it is Jasenovac, the central location of the Holocaust in Croatia, the site where 85,000 Serbs, Jews, and Roma were killed in unspeakably gruesome ways, that continues to be the most significant and contested site of Holocaust remembrance in Croatia. Now, there are almost no historical photographs of Jasenovac, as the Ustasha by the end of the war blew it up and destroyed all records, as the communist partisans were advancing. So this photograph of a Jewish man forced to remove his ring right before being shot is a rare surviving photograph. Today, there are also no physical remains of the camp. Instead, there's this towering and beautiful flower memorial built in the 1960s during communist Yugoslavia. However, a new narrative has emerged in the past few years in Croatia that claims that the story of Jasenovac was overblown and that its high death toll was fabricated by Yugoslav communists and later Serbian nationalist propaganda. This narrative has then further morphed into the claim that Jasenovac was in fact not a fascist camp at all, but it was run by communists as a place of mass execution of Croatian patriots after the end of World War II. This narrative is promoted by established as well as revisionist historians, including a brand new research institute which purpose is to determine the truth about the communist camp. A high-profile recent revisionist push was the film Jasenovac the Truth, which received official award by the city of Zagreb, the capital of Croatia. The film purports to show evidence that Jasenovac was in fact run by communists. And the evidence for these claims is almost comical in its amateurish forgery. There are fake newspaper headlines, there's images of bodies turning up on the banks of the river, which is located upstream from the camp, photographs of apparently happy and content Serbian Jewish inmates, as if to show that nothing bad happened there during the war, which turned out to be photographs of a football team from 1978, and so on. But no matter, this revisionism has become so mainstream and so state-sponsored that in 2018, Croatian president called for the creation of an international commission to determine the truth about the camp between 41 and 45, but also after, she said, indicating that the narrative that Jasenovac was a communist camp after the war was now accepted at the top seat of power. And similarly, in the attempt to erase fascist crimes and use their imagery to represent real or imagined communism, at the site of the Stara Gradiška camp, which was part of the Jasenovac complex of camps, the Croatian government mounted a memorial plaque in 2011 memorializing, quote, political prisoners, victims of the communist regime, who perished in the Starogradiška camp, Starogradiška prison, on the occasion of August 23rd, Day of Commemoration of Victims of Totalitarian and Authoritarian Regimes, end quote. And note the direct use of the EU resolution establishing August 23rd as a day of commemoration of victims of totalitarianisms. And the use of the word prison and not camp is important because it directs remembrance to the pre-war and post-war period, where the site indeed was used as a regular criminal prison, and not to the World War II era Ustaša death camp, where more than 12,000 Serbs, Jews, Roma, and other enemies of the independent state of Croatia, including a very high number of women and children, were killed. Out of 3 memorial plaques placed at the site of Stara Gradiška, not a single one indicates that it was the major concentration camp during World War II. 200 meters away, however, there is an old monument to victims of fascism from 1994 to 1945 that has since crumbled and is in ruins. Nobody bothered to repair it. And all of this revisionism has happened not in spite, but as a result of EU's own practices of remembrance, especially its reductionist interpretation of the 20th century as an era of two totalitarianisms, equal in their criminal nature. EU's youngest member, Croatia, was nothing but a quick study. So let me conclude. Why the Holocaust? Why now? The memory of the Holocaust has been debated and revisited and debated again. So why does all this matter? My principal point that I want to leave you with is that while the historical and moral importance of Holocaust remembrance should be self-evident, Holocaust remembrance is also important for global politics. As my research documents the move toward Holocaust appropriation across post-communist Europe, indicates that there is a lot going on under the European Union cloak. As the alarming turns to liberalism in Poland and Hungary show, joining the EU was not the end of history its architects imagined. And in fact, EU accession has allowed these states to embark on radical projects of historical conversion, such as this cartoon published in a right-wing Polish magazine, which do tremendous violence to the historical record of World War II for very contemporary political purposes. So the question that motivated my research is simply, how did we get here? What explains the need of so many post-communist East European states to revisit the Holocaust now, 75 years later, and control the way in which the Holocaust is remembered, understood, and interpreted? And the argument I made today is that these developments could best be understood as actions of profoundly ontologically insecure states. And while scholars can analyze domestic political machinations of various political structures, right-wing and or popular political parties in particular, especially those aligned with populism, and also ways in which they have instrumentalized Holocaust remembrance to make very specific domestic political gains, such as, for example, expanding the voter base or delegitimizing liberal opponents or mobilizing nationalism, I wanted to take a broader view. And I explored how states use their power, especially their mnemonic power over political memory, when their sense of self, their identity, was threatened by external political narratives that undermined the very basis of that identity. And as I have briefly shown, as they pursued their post-communist new European identities, these states encountered a solidified and codified political memory of the Holocaust, a memory which did not fit with their own understanding of World War II. The desire to become European, to finally rejoin the West, then produced a particular type of Holocaust remembrance, which nominally followed the Western canon. Memorial days were instituted, museums were opened, memorials were built, textbooks were adapted. But in doing so, used the existing narrative and visual imagery of the Holocaust to fight the real memory battle of delegitimizing and criminalizing communism. So I hope to demonstrate ways in which post-communist states constructed a narrative about the past that bolsters their identity and self-esteem in the present. Practices of Holocaust remembrance I described are important for contemporary politics because they indicate that the basis of nation building after communism was ethnic and exclusionary. And while this new identity construction may not be about the Jews or about the Holocaust at all, it comes from the place of exclusion of others, the non-existent Jews, but also the existent new others, refugees, migrants, or other ethnic minorities, such as the Roma or Muslims. But most significantly and most globally, the great delegitimation of communism that has swept Europe since 1991 has also produced a de-delegitimation of fascism, which is repackaged, retold, and reinterpreted to look more palatable and polite in the 21st century. The great tragedy of the anti-communist moment is that it has beaconed and made less imperative our collective anti-fascist moment, and we are now living the consequences. The Shoah, therefore, is not only East European past, it also continues to be its present. And with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Questions?
Should I
make a comment?
Do you want me to call, or do you want to?
Yeah, you call.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to make a comment. I'm not a student. I've been through and done all this stuff. But I am a Jew. And I have to say, I'm sitting here shocked at the map of Croatia. Because as a Jew, I know that the Croatians were amongst the worst. And when I went to Croatia, visit, I said to myself when I entered the country, I'm not spending a dime here. So in other words, my perspective and the Jewish perspective is totally antithetical to the reality that is now being presented. But now that I'm living in this dystopian America with fake news and everything being reinterpreted, I can understand how this kind of craziness comes to be because I'm living in it. And what am I doing about it? Nothing. You see the connection?
I absolutely do. I mean, and I'm just briefly going to respond to your comment. I think that's right. I think part of the motivation, well, there are many motivations for this book, but one thing that I really wanted to do in terms of my case selection, I wanted to bring the story about the Holocaust in Croatia and in Serbia, in the southern Europe area, in conversation with the story about the Holocaust in the rest of Europe, because it is a very understudied area. And I wanted to draw connections to both how the pre-war Jewish life in those countries, and then also how the Holocaust played out, and how we focus so much on Poland and Hungary, and on the kind of the core examples, and we miss these events that are happening in revisionist policies on the periphery of Central Europe have gone, they're outside our central vision. And the point that I make in the book is that they actually should be central part of our understanding.
That was my other question. So Poland is unified, which was the goal. You were saying, did I hear this correctly, that more Jews were murdered in Croatia than in Poland?
No. Percentage-wise, no. Certainly more Jews. Yeah. Actually, I said that percentage-wise, most Jews were killed in Lithuania, but 95%. 95%.
Lithuania was something.
There were 200,000. It's about 140,000 Jews who lived in Lithuania. Then a lot of Polish Jews fled into Lithuania, and so on the eve of the Holocaust, there are about 200,000 Lithuanian, Polish, other Jews, and 95% of them were killed. So that is the highest percentage-wise. But in terms of overall numbers, certainly Poland.
Someone in the back?
Yeah, I had 2 points, partially questions. I'm fairly well familiar with this topic with regard to Poland. And I would just say that there were other tendencies as well. I mean, there has been an effort by certainly a generation above me, those who grew up after 1989, to actually uncover the truth about the Holocaust, which was suppressed under the Stalinists for many decades. I mean, that's a complicated subject, but there was such a tendency. It wasn't immediately this universal, and Poland, obviously, I mean, 30–40% of the urban population was Jewish. I mean, it was a massive issue. It was the largest Jewish population in Europe and the world. So I think the question of this kind of ontological need, like I felt a little uncomfortable about how you theorize why this turn occurred, because there are actual political forces involved. And I mean, they were similar, I think, in Poland as to those that you described for Croatia, which is a place that I don't know that well, but I think we have to also consider about, you know, there's now, I think, especially in Poland, but all over Europe, there's a real backlash against whatever attempts and progress has been made in the study of the Holocaust. And I mean, as you correctly pointed out, this didn't start early. I mean, in Germany, it really didn't start until the 80s and frankly the 90s. I mean, the first serious studies by German historians about the Holocaust occurred in the 90s. The other point I wanted to make, I've been personally very disturbed by the fact that this is not just going on in Eastern Europe, but as you say, it's been legitimized by EU resolutions. There was another one in September, I think, where this same language was employed that is employed by Ukrainian Polish fascists, to be perfectly blunt, and by academics. I mean, in Germany, in the US, I mean, the Bloodlands book by Timothy Snyder, I think, is, you know, one that won awards for definite reasons in those countries.
And it's
so
very popular.
So I think we have to be aware that this is not just going on in some small state in Europe. I mean, they spearheaded it. They're the very open Nazi traditions are very, I mean, blunt, but this has been legitimized, frankly, in academia, and I think that's the most troubling. Like, frankly, to some extent, Nazis fine, they're Nazis, but you know what's going on elsewhere.
Yeah. So I agree with both points. So on the first point, surely there's contestation. So I mean, you know, in a 30-minute talk, I could just talk about so much. But in the book, I go into as much detail as I can into various moments of contestation of this narrative. So the cases that I talk about in depth in the book are Serbia, Croatia, and Lithuania, and then I extend the analysis to other countries. But those are the core of the book, and I go into great detail about how at different points in time this memory developed and what were points of domestic contestation. So who were the domestic actors who tried to counteract, and what happened to those efforts. So there's a lot of discussion about layers of memory and domestic political fights that this memory produced. But what I am interested is, I'm more interested in the larger hegemonic memory that has taken hold, that is very difficult to question, than I am in, you know, a very good group of local historians who are shouting and saying this is bad. Of course they exist, but the political impact is much, much smaller than is of the main very pervasive political narrative that has taken hold through government structures, government-funded institutions, and especially the media. So, but certainly, and I could talk more about various actors in different countries and how they fought against this or try to produce a different narrative. On your second point, I absolutely agree. This is not, and I want to make this very clear, this is not, my argument is not that, you know, the way in which the Holocaust is remembered in the West is perfect and it's just that something horrible or wrong has gone on in the East. There's tremendous revisionism in the West, in academia, and in, you know, West European countries themselves. I mean, you know, everybody in Amsterdam talks about how, you know, everybody was hiding in Frank, and everybody was in resistance, and all of France was against the Vichy, and everybody was in the partisans, and we of course know that's not true. The reason why I focus on the East is that my interest is in the transition from communism to post-communism, which is not obviously what we had in the West. So I'm interested in the move from communism to post-communism and what that produced. And I'm also interested in the places and spaces and the geographic location of the genocide and how those places look like the sites of absence. So I wanted to go and see the killing sites. So my interest is in kind of both the physical space of genocide, but also the transition from communism. So it's not to say that the way in which, I mean, I have a section in the book where I talked about this big outcry how in Canada, for example, a couple of years ago, there was this new Holocaust memorial that was opened that doesn't mention the Jews. It's a big memorial in Ottawa, so you would think it's a big Justin Trudeau, you know, cut the red ribbon, and it was all this big thing, and it was about a human rights monument for our times. It's called a Holocaust memorial. So I mean, this effacing of Jews is not an East European phenomenon. So it's a very complicated issue. I can talk more about, especially, I like your point about the academic debates, and there's a lot going on in kind of the politicization of Holocaust research. Some of you may have followed a little bit of what happened with some of the statements the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum itself made and the backlash that produced, and I can talk more about that. But it's a very difficult kind of scholarly, ethical question.
I don't know. Yeah.
So I was struck that you never used the word anti-Semitism. And I suspect that it's deliberate on your part, but I wonder what its introduction would do to your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's anti-Semitism. I mean, it's kind of, you know, if there were no anti-Semitism, nobody would kill the Jews. So in some ways, it's a too obvious point. I was interested more in, so when I chose my different cases, I wanted to look at countries that had also different levels of anti-Semitism and see the memories and practices of remembrance change. So where Serbia, for example, is different from Croatia and from Lithuania, and especially from Poland, Serbia had a very low popular anti-Semitism before the war. It also could be because it's a very small Jewish community, about 35,000 people, and also because there's all these other reasons. For example, there was a high participation of Jews, Serbian Jews, in World War I, fighting with Serbs, and so that kind of created a very kind of pro-Semitic public perception. Croatia obviously has a different situation. Poland, the Baltics have their own. So I wanted to see if there's something that we can gather is different in countries that have historically a more favorable, and this is the difference. Memory appropriation happens everywhere. The type of memory appropriation is different. So in the book I call the type of memory appropriation in the Serbian case is more indifference. So it's not driven by contemporary levels of anti-Semitism, which I think may be the case in other countries. It's more an indifference to the suffering of others because the suffering of your own ethnic group is so much stronger. So the fact that they're Jews is irrelevant. The fact that they're taking the spotlight from our own suffering is relevant. That is very different in a place like Lithuania or a place like Poland that has anti-Semitism. Until today, the rates are pretty high. To the extent we can trust these surveys, I don't know what to make of these. I don't make much use of it. I find it very difficult to base a lot of conclusion on asking people. So, but the surveys we have show a very high rate of anti-Semitism in a place like Lithuania and a place like Poland. But those are also the places that continue to have a very strong narrative of, be very careful here, of basically what in the Holocaust literature we call the Židokomuna. The Jews were communists, and so they were not innocent, and this is justifiable, understandable, not just, but understandable because they were all communists wanting to kill the communists. That doesn't exist in Serbia, because Serbia was not under Soviet occupation, so there was no NKVD. To blame the Jews for. So the level, so to answer a very long-winded answer to your question, I think anti-Semitism is pervasive, but it only explains to a certain extent. There are other political dynamics and other historical legacies and political dynamics of how the Holocaust played out, how communism played out, and what was, if any, the role of Soviet occupation that's kind of mutually constitutes anti-Semitism. Very long answer to it. Yes, is anti-Semitism.
Go ahead.
So just as a quick question off of your mention of how one of your interests was the actual killing fields and how they've been obscured. I know, at least in the US, there's been a push from archaeologists to do things like dig up the Tulsa Greenwood massacre site. Do you think in these contexts there's room for that kind of evidentiary progress towards uncovering these truths, or would the change have to come from a shift in the state dynamics that engender this phenomenon in the first place?
So yeah, no, so that's good. So it brings back to the earlier question about, you know, what are the moments of political contestation and which political groups are doing what. So again, I want to be very clear, there are many scholars, there are many researchers locally who are doing all sorts of things. So in, let's see if I can pull up, do I have internet access?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to pull up one of those exact things that you're talking about. So there's a national project between Serbia and Croatia. They never collaborate, but they collaborate on this by independent researchers. So this is not, these are not state effort. It's called Killing Sites. Let me see if the bill's going to come up. So they do. I'm sorry. No, what is it? I'm going to find like cure for illnesses. That's not really. Because it gives you exactly what you were talking about. I'm really not doing this right. I'm sorry. Okay, I'll keep talking while I'm trying to find it. So this is a Serbian-Croatian scholarly project that it's trying to map. It is trying to map hidden sites or unmemorialized sites of killing in both Serbia and Croatia. So it's a very prominent collaboration that exists between historians, and it's trying to find, I'm going to try and find you an actual image. So they have somewhere here was a map. I keep getting the same. Anyway, so on this site, there's a map of many sites of killing. A lot of them are completely unmemorialized. So part of the thing that these researchers did is found sites looking through archival research and looking through witness testimonies that said this was a site of killing, and that there's nothing that exists, there's no memorial. And they would go and do archaeological digging and find stuff. And so it's now mapping hundreds of sites in Serbia and in Croatia, including some very remote sites in Croatia. I showed you that map of camps, but the problem in Croatia is that a lot of people were killed in very mountainous terrain. So the Jadovno camp, for example, where probably 40,000 people were killed, they were just dropped from the mountain into the ravines alive. And it's a very inhospitable terrain, so you can't go there. It's like a big drop. And so they're trying to figure out how to map and how to create knowledge about what happened, but also memorial sites. So all of this exists, right? So this is the problem, right? So this exists, there's international collaboration, but they cannot get government to support any of this, either financially. So even here you can probably see, like if I find their funding page, so this is who is funding them. This is the Serbian Jewish Association. This is the Independent Center for Research and Education on the Holocaust, and this is the Cultural Studies program from the Department of Cultural Studies in Rijeka, Croatia. All right, that's it. And they're all doing this by themselves. So what is then the impact and the long-term narrative change when this is just a bunch of young entrepreneurial historians who cannot get a grant from the government of either country to do this? So how then can this be changed into history textbooks, for example? So all of this research exists, and most of my book is based on really the excellent research that historians and archaeologists have been doing. But it's the next step. How do you change the political narrative? It's become so hegemonic that it's really difficult to correct for.
Yeah, so I have two questions. So you mentioned the Truth Commission in Croatia in 2018, and we see the increase of these Truth Commissions across the region, both about the Holocaust and also the 90s. So first is, who in your opinion has the power and ability, if any actor, to delegitimize those efforts? Like how do scholars from the region or across try to push back? And whether in general you think this contestation of history is just a regular, is a cycling history that in the end will produce some type of agreement, which I'm very not hopeful of. And the other thing is, you speak a lot about your book about this identity struggle, which to me seems to have been present for decades, for centuries in this region. So what do you think, what are some political currents that make this lack of identity security more salient or not? Because it seems that over the recent, let's say, 5-10 years, it's almost more intense and more tense than it was before. So what are the political currents that are making it kind of spike recently?
Okay, so the way that the role of identity plays a role in my argument is that these countries have insecure identities because they have to build their statehood from scratch after the end of communism. Communism provided a sense of identity and a sense of political legitimacy. They knew who they were this and that, and they built a certain sense of political cohesion and political legitimacy on that model. Obviously, you know, in Yugoslavia, the political legitimacy was different than in some other communist countries. Yugoslavia, as you know, is a little bit different. But in the Yugoslav case, a lot of the political legitimacy under communism and a lot of the identity that communist Yugoslavia had was as a multicultural kind of brotherhood and unity narrative. We're all in this together. But this was a very important and very, very salient identity for many people. That is gone. Yugoslavia was murdered. I like to say, it didn't just die. I mean, it was a clear cause of death. And now you have independent countries that are trying to come up with a sense of identity of who they are in this new world and who they want to be. And so, do they want to be European? Do they want to belong to a larger European family? What does that mean? What kinds of political cost does becoming European take? But also, how do you maintain your own sense of your own biography as a nation if you're building your identity on something in which you're a perpetrator? So I think I guess in a social science language, end of communism becomes an exogenous shock to which these countries have to react. And in my argument, they react with a lot of anxiety and stress. And they try to recover from this anxiety and stress, or to kind of piece the puzzle together by forming a very, very strong ethnic, nationalist, ethnically homogeneous. So Serbia is now a country of Serbs. Croatia is a country of Croats. Croatia is not a country of Croatian citizens. It's a country of Croats. And that really matters. And how the Constitution says who is your citizen really matters. So I think that's the role of identity that lays in my narrative. On your first question, I think I'll just go back to, I'm interested. There's studies to be written about domestic political actors, domestic instances, all of that. I am interested in large hegemonic state identities. I'm interested in a large hegemonic story that every child in Serbia knows. So every child, when I grew up in Serbia, this was the narrative that I heard about the Holocaust. Holocaust was horrible. It's something that happened in north of Europe. It was very sad what happened to the Jews in North Europe. And in Poland, everything, from Serbia, because north, so Poland's north. So it was horrible what happened to the Jews. It was awful. Here in Serbia, we protected all our Jews. In fact, we protected, it really is that basic. It's kind of like Serbian version of Anna Franka, a Jewish actress, Raquel Ferrari, who survived the Holocaust, and she was indeed hidden as a child by Serbian righteous Gentiles. But I heard the story from dozens of people that their grandparents hid Raquel Ferrari. And I'm like, no, I hid her. No, I hid Raquel Ferrari. And so that became a part of, it's a very, very, very strong narrative in Serbia that's not an anti-Semitic, it's a narrative about our own righteousness. But to my story, that's important, because it's not really a story about the Jews or about the Holocaust, it's about the virtuous nature of the Serbian nation, which then absolves it from its own crimes in the 1990s. And they would say that publicly, and I talk at great length in the book about how they use the narrative. We could possibly not be perpetrators in the 1990s. We saved the Jews. We're the good ones. look at Croatia. And so I'm interested in those narratives. How do they get built? How do they get transmitted? How do they still have lasting power? Some of the, I get a lot of pushback from all sorts of people on the project and on other things I write. From Serbia, it's always the same. It's not that anything is wrong. How can you compare us to Croatia? We hid our Jews. They were the Ustasha, they were the bad ones. How can you compare us? So that's, because this narrative is so strong, how we were the good actors in this. And that's what I'm interested in that larger story.
This is more of a clarification question, I guess. So the sense that I got from your talk and the presentation was like, it seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that on the one hand, there's this sort of like appropriation of Holocaust memorialization, and on the other hand, there's a kind of, not a denial, but a sort of erasure or a denial in the sense of a reticence on the part of the state to explicitly memorialize. So can you talk a little bit more about how those two things would coincide, or specify sort of what are the conditions under which we would expect to see appropriation versus kind of, I don't want to say denial, but sort of suppression or erasure?
So erasure happened everywhere in the countries that I studied. The difference is in the type. So so all of this for me is memory appropriation in the sense that it's using Holocaust memory to tell a different story. But what story is being told is different, and what type of remembrance practices are shaped is different. So in the Serbian case, as I said before, it's more about memory indifference and really a kind of inversion. Like, while you're talking about the Jews, yeah, that was bad, but really it's this horrible thing that happened to us. So you'll always again hear stories about, yeah, while we're talking about the Jews, so many Serbs were killed in World War II. So again, it's both erasure, because the Jewish suffering is just, it's not relevant really, but it's also an inversion into suffering of us, especially suffering under communism. In the Croatian case, I call it more memory decoupling, where it's a very conscious effort on behalf of post-independence, post-1991 Croatian government to separate the Holocaust of Jews from the genocide against the Serbs. And we talked about this yesterday. So it's a very, very common practice for Croatian presidents to go to Yad Vashem, to apologize to any victim of any horrible German horror. And Croatian until recent President Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović would routinely go and cry at Yad Vashem and talk about all these horrible things that have happened. But that's something the Germans did, or something the Germans told Croatians to do. And there's no discussion at all of the genocide against Serbs and Roma that was done by the same regime using the same policies. So it's a decoupling, it's a memory decoupling. So one thing can be, and so memorialized, the other thing is not even. So Croatian responsibility doesn't exist. Holocaust exists, but it's something that Germans did. So this comes up actually fairly routinely. There's a new project in Croatia to build a Holocaust memorial to the 6 million Jews of Europe in downtown Zagreb. And it's going to be this beautiful new project, and it's going to be paid by the state, and it's going to be finally something that Croatia remembers. But it's a memorial to 6 million Jews of Europe. It's not a memorial to 35,000 Croatian Jews, and there's no mention of the independent state of Croatia. So it's not a denial, it's a Holocaust memorial in downtown Zagreb, but it's redirecting memory into this larger kind of amorphous Holocaust of 6 million people somewhere that happened, that we had nothing to do with. And then in the Lithuanian case, I talk about memory replacement, where the memory of the Holocaust is replaced by the memory of Soviet occupation, or what is often called Soviet genocide. So again, Jews are erased. But there's a replacement of this is really what, and that's why I use the example of the museum, which of course me being, I was like, oh, Museum of Genocide, let's go in. Oh. So, you know, again, as I talk a lot about a book, Lithuania has Holocaust memorials, it has Holocaust museums, but they're not called, the Museum of Genocide is the Museum of Soviet Occupation. occupation. It's changed its name. There was a lot of international outcry, so now it's called Museum of Occupation and Foreign Fights. It's just not great. But I think you had, yeah.
How, if at all, and I would assume there would be a connection here, do you see the attitude towards Jews prior to World War II in these countries affecting the way they're looking at the situation currently?
Yeah. Okay. So that relates to the anti-Semitism question. So it varies by country. Like it can vary anywhere. It varies in Eastern Europe. It varies in Western Europe. So in the Serbian case, as I mentioned, I really tried hard. I could not find evidence of popular anti-Semitism, like individual people. Certainly no evidence of any pogroms by Serbian civilians against the Jews before the
Could
Holocaust.
you look at Poland, for example?
Right, that's what I mean. So I couldn't find it in Serbia. Poland is a completely different case. And Poland has, and we were talking about, there's a couple of new books that came out about Jewish pogroms against, Polish civilians pogroms against the Jews on the eve of the Holocaust. And there were many sites and thousands of people. I mean, Poland is such a, in some ways, it's like an overdetermined case. I mean, it's like the heart of the genocide, really. It's population-wise, numbers-wise, geography-wise. Anti-Semitism rates were very high, and the level of Polish participation was also high. But then you have an interesting case of Lithuania. And so I just came, and again, sorry, I'm repeating the discussion from dinner. I just came from a conference that I helped put together last week about social science and the Holocaust, where we had a paper on Lithuania, not by me, but by another scholar, that tried to compare how is it that in Lithuania, even though most Jews were killed by Lithuanians, they were killed by armed Lithuanian militia. So we don't have as much evidence of just like neighbors killing neighbors, but more like Lithuanian militiamen who were then incorporated into the SS units who were doing the killing. And it was a very fiery discussion at our conference because some scholars were arguing, well, what's the difference? It's neighbor killing neighbor, just a neighbor with a white armband or a militia, but it's still a neighbor. Versus others who were arguing, no, it's a very different dynamic. It was not like neighbors going around torching somebody down the street. They were all organized into a particular paramilitary unit. So it was kind of a job. So then another scholar said, well, that's just because, you know, in Poland, if they had the militias, they would have organized them. So it's a very contentious issue. And I will say that when I was doing research on Lithuania, by far the most contentious issue I had to deal with was whether there were pre-German pogroms of Jews on the eve of the Holocaust, especially the first week, in that chaotic week when Soviets are retreating, the Germans are coming in, the Germans have not yet taken up positions. There's a week in June of 1941 where a couple of thousand Jews were killed. Lithuanian historians claim that Germans have already arrived, and yes, these were Lithuanians killing, but Germans were kind of egging them on, and they were there watching and blah, blah. There are many witness testimonies and survivor testimonies who said there was no German in sight. And I can't tell you the hours of my life that I dedicated trying to parse these things, and it comes down to what kind of evidence you trust. These Lithuanian historians that I talk to want to see documents. And American historians and Israeli historians I talk to say, look at the oral testaments. And it's a methodological issue, and I put it all in the book, and I came down one way or the other. But it's a very raw, very painful and very raw, contentious issue, that one that you bring, the neighbor against neighbor violence. And it really varies by country. Sorry, long answer.
Could I just, one more thing though, specifically on Poland, for example. How do you think the considerable anti-Semitism which is live in Poland today affects how they're looking at things? And I should add, by the way, at one point I was married to a woman whose father had been saved by the mother, Polish woman. She looked at Poland after leaving, and all she could see was one anti-Semite after another. She thought it was really all over the place. And indeed, well, she identified as Jewish. Her brothers did not. And for very good reason. You know, so how does the continuing anti-Semitism in Poland affect how they look at things today?
Yeah.
And
That's
let's
a
not
little bit,
forget
yeah, it's a
the
little bit above my
pogroms
pay
after
grade.
the war.
Yeah, for any two.
Because I'm not a scholar of Poland, so I really can't claim. I think it's very obvious that the levels of anti-Semitism in Poland were very high before the war. We also have evidence, as I just said, that there's a new book by Jason Wittenberg and Jeff Kopstein on neighbor violence. So I think all of that is, this is just my opinion, so I've not done research in Poland, so it just seems to me that legacies of anti-Semitism continue. And the question is, to what extent are those legacies and those narratives corrected, and to what extent are they left to foster? So things like the narrative of Židov komuna, the Jews, were communists, to what extent that continues, to what extent anybody in the public space would correct that, I think is a problem. And I think we have ample evidence of the continuing, very unsettled relationship with the Holocaust that the current Polish government is legislating through memory laws, through appointments at museums, through shutting down institutions, and through policing research. So all of that would indicate that there's an unsettled narrative about what is going on.
One other thing. The work of someone like Father Desbois, documenting newly really found burial sites, and his particularly most recent book of great detail about the work of bystanders in the Holocaust. Now this is mostly in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's in Ukraine and Belarus.
How does something like that, which in a sense is new evidence, which they have to look at, how does that affect the perspective?
But it depends, it goes back to our first, so it depends how scholarly research is transmitted. I mean, it seems to me that we have too much, we have like faith that, oh, like the book is going to be published, so now, like, so what? Jan Gross published the book on Jedwabne, and he can't go back to Poland. So there's a big disconnect between scholarly enterprise and public narratives. So it's not enough to have scholarly research. How is that transmitted? So is that transmitted through then media? Is that transmitted through education? Is how is that knowledge then seeping through public attitudes is a much more complex issue than having availability of new evidence. There's evidence for all of this. In Lithuania, I have 50 YouTube videos that a researcher put up in Yiddish talking about what they call the first week of killing. There's evidence, 50 people who talked about, you know, who came to their village and how they were not members of the... It's on YouTube, there's a reason, it's not part of the public narrative. It's not a lack of evidence. It's why this narrative persists and what is its political use. That's what interests me. We have evidence.
Okay, one quick last question, or we are finished? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.